Something in Genesis doesn't add up. Most people read right past it. Genesis 1 says God created the heavens and the earth. Clean, definitive, final. But then verse 2 arrives, and the language changes completely. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. That word was, in Hebrew, haya, can also mean became. Let's slow down here, because that shift matters enormously. If the earth became formless and void, something may have preceded that condition. Not humans, necessarily, but something. Some state, some prior order. The text doesn't explain what happened between verse 1 and verse 2. It just shows you the gap and moves on. That silence has occupied serious scholars for centuries. Some call it the ruin reconstruction view. This doesn't mean the Bible confirms a prior civilization, but the text allows the question to exist. And once you ask it honestly, you start noticing other clues scattered through Scripture. Clues that are quiet, but consistent. Let's look at one. Isaiah 45:18 says this clearly. God did not create the earth in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. That word translated in vain is tohu in Hebrew. Formless, chaotic, empty. And it is the exact same word used in Genesis 1:2, without form. Tohu. So Isaiah says God did not create the earth tohu, but Genesis 1:2 shows it as tohu. Think about that carefully. If God didn't create it that way, how did it get that way? The text doesn't answer directly, but it raises a question the text itself seems to be asking. Now turn to Jeremiah 4:23. This is where it gets interesting. Jeremiah describes a vision. He says, I looked at the earth, and it was without form and void, tohu vavohu. Word for word, the exact language of Genesis 1:2. But Jeremiah is not describing creation week. He is describing a scene of devastating judgment. Cities broken down, no people, no birds, the fruitful land turned back into wilderness. He is using the language of primordial chaos to describe what divine judgment looks like. This matters because it suggests the Genesis language carries judgment tones. Not merely God started with nothing, but possibly something was undone before our story begins. We have to be careful here. The text does not prove a prior civilization. It doesn't say that, but the language is not random. Jeremiah clearly knew what he was echoing. The connection is deliberate, and the deliberate connections in Scripture are always worth following. Now turn to Job 38. Because God speaks here and says something quietly staggering. God asks Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Then verse 7 arrives. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Sons of God, singing at creation, beings already present when the foundation was being laid. Who are these beings? Genesis gives them no backstory. They simply exist before the narrative begins. They are already ancient when Adam is still new. Scripture elsewhere uses sons of God to describe a category of angelic heavenly beings. Job 1 and 2 show them appearing before God's throne. This is not metaphor. This is presented as real. And they were there at creation, watching, rejoicing, already bearing witness. Let that breathe. Before man drew his first breath, something was already ancient. Before Adam saw his first sunrise, these watchers had been present at the laying of the foundations. The universe, at the moment of Adam's creation, was not empty. It was already populated with a created order we are barely shown. Now go back to Genesis 3. Most people read it as a simple story. A serpent, a woman, a fruit, a fall. But notice how the serpent is introduced. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field. Just like that. No origin, no explanation of where he came from or how long he had existed. We are told he was crafty. We are not told his history. A being with that level of ancient cunning does not arrive without a story behind him. The text assumes the audience already understood the spiritual order behind that figure. There was an assumed background, a pre-existing world of spiritual activity the text takes for granted. The original readers apparently didn't need the backstory filled in, which means it was already known. Now consider Genesis 4. Cain kills Abel. He is exiled. He goes to the land of Nod and finds a wife there. Most readers pause here. Where exactly did she come from? The traditional answer is other children of Adam and Eve, descendants not yet named, which is possible. The text does not exclude it, but it also doesn't explain it. What it does show is a world that arrives fully furnished, within just a few generations, cities, trades, instruments, culture. Genesis 4:17 says Cain built a city. A city implies people, infrastructure, society. How does one man build a city for himself? The text does not pause to answer. Either the genealogy is highly compressed, across many generations we are not shown, or the surrounding world had more in it than Genesis names explicitly. Again, this does not prove pre-Adamic humans. We have to be careful not to go beyond what the text says. But the honest reader notices that the world of Genesis 4 feels already lived in. It doesn't read like a world with three people. It reads like a world with history already behind it. Now let's anchor in Paul, because he speaks into this framework directly. Romans 5:12 says, "Through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin." This verse is the hinge of redemption theology. Adam is the turning point of human mortality. Whatever preceded Adam, whatever spiritual activity or ancient history came before him, Paul does not address it. What he addresses is the human covenant line. The story of sin, death, and salvation runs specifically through Adam. 1 Corinthians 15 builds directly on this. Paul calls Jesus the last Adam. The first Adam brought death. The last Adam brings life. The theological weight of Scripture rests on this one lineage, not on what may or may not have preceded it. The redemptive arc runs through Adam, forward to Christ. Full stop. This is important, because the pre-Adamic question, while genuinely interesting, is not the Bible's primary concern. The Bible is not primarily answering what existed before Adam. It is answering, how does humanity fall, and how is it redeemed? Those are two very different questions, and Scripture gives a complete, layered answer to the second one. But the first question does not disappear, because the text keeps leaving doors slightly ajar. Genesis 1:1-2 leaves a gap between creation and chaos. Isaiah 45:18 asks us to notice what's strange about it. Jeremiah 4:23 colors that chaos with the language of ruin and judgment. Job 38 places ancient joyful beings at the very moment of creation. Genesis 3 drops a cunning adversary with no origin story. Genesis 4 opens into a world that feels already populated. None of these are definitive proof, but they are clues. Quiet, strange, and consistent. The pattern is deliberate. The Bible is a layered document, not a single sentence to be skimmed. Scholars who have sat with this seriously, from Thomas Chalmers in the 1800s forward, did not invent the gap. They found it already present in the Hebrew text. Some of them went too far. Some built entire theological systems on a single grammatical possibility. We don't have to do that. We can hold the question with open hands. What the text appears to suggest, without it becoming doctrine, is that before Adam walked in the garden, the universe was not empty. Before the breath of God formed the first man from dust, something had already transpired in the created order. A spiritual hierarchy of ancient beings, morning stars, sons of God, watchers at creation's edge, and perhaps, a material world that arrived at tohu vavohu not from its first moment, but from some prior disruption. We are not given the full account of. The Bible is quieter than we expect, and deeper than we are usually taught. It does not explain everything. It never promises to. What it does is point consistently toward a God who is older than our beginning, a God who was creating long before man existed to record the story, a God who asked Job from the storm, "Where were you when I laid the foundations?" The implied answer is, you weren't, but someone was. Those morning stars, those sons of God, they shouted for joy. There was song before the silence Adam broke. There was order before the chaos described in verse 2. And after the chaos, after the tohu, God moved. He hovered over the face of the waters. That Hebrew word for hovered, merachafet, is the same word used for an eagle, hovering protectively over its young, not distant, not passive, purposeful, preparing, not creating from absolute nothing in that moment, but restoring, reforming, moving with intention over the ruin. At least that is one way to read it. The text leaves room for both interpretations. What it does not leave room for is a God who was caught off guard. Whatever preceded Adam, God was not surprised by it. He moved over the face of the deep with all the authority of one who had always been sovereign. The darkness did not define him. It revealed what he was about to do. And then, light. And then, order. And then, a man formed from dust, breathing, because God breathed into him specifically. The most important thing the pre-Adamic question teaches us is this: our story is not the only story, but it is the chosen one. Adam was not the first thing God ever created. He was the first man. And that distinction matters, because the redemptive story runs through him, and through the last Adam specifically, not through the morning stars, not through whatever spiritual order came before, through one man. Then the last man, then resurrection. That is the thread Scripture asks us to follow. So when you read Genesis 1:2, slow down before you move to the light. Sit in the gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Ask what the Hebrew is actually doing. Ask why Isaiah would remind you that God didn't create the earth tohu if his own word shows it as tohu before the restoration begins. Ask who the morning stars were. Ask why the serpent arrived without a backstory. Ask how Cain built a city. Read these verses slowly, carefully, with fresh eyes. You don't have to arrive at a complete system. You don't have to build a doctrine around the silence. But you also don't have to pretend the questions aren't written into the text. The Bible trusts you with tension. It always has. It gives you a creation account that is not the beginning of everything, but the beginning of this. This people, this covenant, this redemption, what existed before it remains, largely, behind a door the text barely opens, but the door has keyholes, and the light coming through them is real. Read it again with this in mind. The text is stranger and richer than most sermons have the time to admit. And once you see the gaps, the echoes, the unanswered silences scattered through Genesis, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Job, you will realize the Bible was never designed to explain everything. It was designed to reveal the one who knows everything. And that is more than enough. Think about that.